Second, to our viewers, you should now be able to turn on the closed captioning or the live transcription feature on Zoom, which is located on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And then finally, we would also like to encourage you to ask questions via the chat. We'll be sharing those questions with the panelists during the Q&A portion of today's talk. With that being said, let's begin. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sylvia Gonzalez. I am co-director of research at the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute, where I oversee our research docket at the intersection of climate change, environmental justice, and economic mobility. For those that are not familiar with the Institute, LPPI was launched about 5 years ago, so we're a relatively young organization with the belief that there is no American agenda without a Latino agenda, and that every issue is a Latino issue, be it access to the ballot box, to the healthcare system, to education, or the topic of today, which is the increasing threat of climate change and extreme weather events to the health, safety, and prosperity of Latino communities. We are honored to host today's incredible panel of experts in an action-oriented dialogue on the effects of intense heat waves and their disproportionate impacts on the lives of Latinos. We'll also be hearing about the lived experiences and stories from the ground and exploring avenues for collaborative action and emerging policy responses to promote health and environmental justice in frontline communities. It is my pleasure today to introduce our event moderator, Professor Michael Mendes. Michael is an assistant professor of environmental planning and policy at the University of California at Irvine, an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, a visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and an esteemed faculty expert at LPPI. Aside from his many contributions to the academic discourse on environmental and climate justice, Michael has made an incredible contribution to state, national, and international initiatives to incorporate environmental justice and the concerns of low-income people of color into climate change policy. Michael will kick off the event with a short overview of his research on extreme heat vulnerability, highlighting the experiences of immigrant and undocumented populations. Michael, I give you the virtual floor, and thank you for guiding us in this important conversation.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. It's such a pleasure to be here today in this historic event, and thank you for UCLA LPPI for hosting this event and bringing an impressive group of panelists, community experts, and policymakers together. And I'm also honored to be here actually in Santa Rosa, California, Northern California, with my other panelist, Luis Olmedo, for another historic first, the first in state and first in nation summit on undocumented and migrant-serving organizations that are providing mutual aid and disaster assistance during disasters like wildfires, heat waves, and other extreme weather events, and really acknowledging that while the Latino community has disparate impacts from climate-induced disasters, some segments of our populations have are worse off, in particularly undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. So I'd like to applaud the work of these organizations that are asserting that disasters, climate change resilience is also an issue that's intersectional and important to immigration and migrant-serving organizations. So I just want to highlight that. Next slide. As many of you know, we are experiencing in California one of the hottest summer in California's history. But what did we really learn less than a week ago? One of the key reflections we can take from this past summer's heat is that we witnessed throughout the state that not everyone equally experiences the burden of climate change. The people who are already the most socially vulnerable in society will experience the greatest impacts of climate change. And these impacts will be more frequent and severe. They will endure higher levels of air and water pollution and more intense wildfires, heat waves, and other environmental and weather hazards. So now more than ever, it is crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harms, particularly in the context of extreme heat to Latino and Indigenous migrants. Next slide. Yet when we talk about heat waves and climate change impacts, it is often articulated in abstract terms, without the faces or human-centered approaches to understanding disparate impacts and the root causes of the systemic injustices. Next slide. In places like California, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis. In the last several years, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequality, are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color, in particular Latino communities. In essence, when heat waves in California occur, they are not isolated disasters. They are the public health. So now more than ever, it is crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and again, how to lessen their harms. These populations are experience an undue burden of marginalization, disenfranchisement, and discrimination in their everyday lives, particularly undocumented individuals, even before disaster strikes. These communities are already underserved and are the least prepared to recover from the most severe harms caused by the climate crisis. In essence, these experiences and these events create a hyper form of marginalization for this population when a disaster like a heat wave occurs. Next slide. For example, migrant farm workers, in particular in California, endure exposure to intense heat combined with physical labor that can be deadly. Numerous migrant worker deaths occur each year due to such conditions. The Center for Disease Control, CDC, reports that heat deaths among farm workers are 20 times greater than among U.S. civilian workers, even when farmers or farms are in compliance with heat-related safety regulations. Moreover, research has shown from the year 2005 to 2014, 198 non-U.S. citizen deaths occurred on farms, which is over the triple that of U.S. citizens. Further, many of these deaths and illnesses may not be counted due to linguistic or cultural barriers, immigration status, or other factors. Farm workers, moreover, may be more vulnerable to extreme heat due to existing health and social disparities. This vulnerability may be heightened due to a warming climate and growing demand for food. And this labor will likely occur during the harvesting months, which coincide and can compound with the most extreme weather events and disasters. And new research out of the University of California reveals that the current heat index that many of us use and understand only provides the full danger from heat waves for people that are actually just sitting in the shade. This leaves out outdoor workers and others who spend hours in the sun. So this can also lead to misjudgment of danger and risk, and understanding that these heat waves are more than just about heat. They also are about humidity, which can make these heat waves more deadly. Next slide. But extreme weather events and existing health disparities alone do not cause death or illness. It is systemic and stems from discrimination, historic disinvestment in communities of color, in terms of infrastructure, labor exploitation, among other factors. To put these environmental inequities and the regional wealth gap into context, I want to focus attention to a local festival. You probably simply know this, it's Coachella, which brings celebrities, artists, and music enthusiasts together. The average attendee pays around $2,500. For comparison, the average income of a farm worker is less than $18,000. Housing affordability is a major issue, which leaves many migrant farm workers living in their cars and also sleeping on parking lot floors during the summer months because it is too hot, over 90 degrees even at midnight. Though rare, the Southern California region is the only place in the United States where scientists have documented heat-related deaths during the winter months due to hot, gusty winds. In addition, residents in eastern Coachella Valley often live in dilapidated mobile home parks with no air conditioning and located sometimes on Native American lands. Undocumented migrants often endure unsafe environments because federal immigration agents cannot deport them on this sovereign territory. These compounding of environmental disasters, which we'll probably hear more from Luis and Assemblymember Garcia, and inequities is a new line of research that others should explore and that I am exploring and working closely with community groups on policy responses and action. Next slide. But the heat impacts on Latino and indigenous migrant communities are not restricted to only agricultural settings. Again, try to put a face and make this less abstract. For example, this summer, Esteban Chavez Jr., who was 24 years old and a delivery driver for UPS, died while delivering packages after he reportedly collapsed inside his UPS truck while in a customer's driveway. The family says he was unconscious for over 20 minutes before someone finally discovered him. In an investigative article published by NBC News in 2019 noted at least 107 UPS workers in 23 states have been hospitalized for heat illnesses since 2015. The company, the company only reports on heat-related incidents in the United States, and the U.S. Postal Service does not have air conditioning in this truck. Next slide. The recent reports by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change cited a growing body of research about the impacts of human-induced climate change and its role on intensifying weather extremes such as heat waves. The report detailed how greenhouse gas emissions are affecting increasingly hotter temperatures, how this warmer climate is expected to increase surface ozone over polluted regions, which is a precursor of smog, and how some aspects such as heat may be amplified in cities because urban areas are typically warmer than surrounding regions, also known as urban heat island effect. These heat islands form because urban surfaces such as roadways and rooftops absorb and emit heat to a greater extent than most natural sources. Therefore, these heat impacts are important to the LGBT community, LGBT community, Latino immigrants, and Latino communities, because many of them reside in urban areas and are part of the population that are socially vulnerable. Next slide. Urban heat islands impact significant because the Latino majority of Latino public schools for Latinos are public and lack green spaces, which some parents call a danger zone due to lack of green spaces and trees. This is some pictures from a new research project I launched with Latino parent leaders in Los Angeles, in Southeast Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley that are really arguing because of the lack of green spaces. It's creating danger zones for their children, making them faint, have headaches and runny noses. For instance, at Adama Elementary School here, only 8% of the school has green spaces. That means 92% is hard blacktop that's creating dangerous situations. One of the parents, we equipped one of the parents here with an infrared gun here, and during the middle of the day, they took a temperature on the playground in one of the rubber surfaces, and at 12 p.m. it clocked 164 degrees on that playground, on the slide, on the rubber. So this creates inequitable situations for our Latino children, and it's really these schools are really a reflection of the broader injustice and disinvestment in our infrastructure for these communities. And then finally, I just next slide. Just like to acknowledge the need to do community engaged research, to work in partnership with the community-based organizations that are working on the ground, providing a platform for them to speak for themselves, to be authors of this data. And I've been working closely with Central Coast as well as Northern California Bay immigrant rights and environmental justice groups on disaster impacts, and doing policy briefings, publications at the federal level with NOAA, at the state level with Cal OES, and then even internationally with the United Nations Migration Agency, really showing how these impacts are not only affecting California, but also shows community resilience and lessons learned for the rest of the globe. So now I'd like to, next slide, now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists that we're really so honored to have. And I'm going to introduce really quickly all their bios and then start off with a question with Marta Segura, who I know has to leave early today. So the first panelist is Marta Segura. She is a strategic, resourceful, environmental and health justice advocate with a focus on social equity, appointed as the first ever Chief Heat Officer and Climate Emergency Mobilization Director for the City of Los Angeles. She is also a leading expert in community health and engagement and has worked across public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Next is Luis Olmedo. He is executive director of the Comite Civico de Valle, an organization located in Imperial Valley whose mission focuses on addressing environmental justice and public health, with the endeavor of improving the lives of disadvantaged communities. Luis is the community advocate who advises on local, regional, and state environmental health programs affecting his local region. Next is Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia, who represents California's 56th Assembly District, which includes cities and unincorporated communities in Eastern Riverside and Imperial County. Assemblymember Garcia has authored dozens of bills and resolutions signed into law, including the historic 2016 climate change package, establishing state emission reductions and the framework to ensure future climate policies, prioritize communities of color. And then finally, we have Marta Guzman, who is the U.S. EPA Regional Administrator of the nation Pacific Southwest region, or Region 9, leading EPA efforts to protect public health and the environment for the region spanning Arizona, California, Hawaii, Nevada, the U.S. Pacific Island territories, and 148 tribal nations. Marta is the first Latina to serve as regional administrator. She came to US EPA after having served as a commissioner at the California Public Utilities Commission and other high-level state government positions as well. So again, it's such a pleasure to have everyone here today. And I'm going to start off with Marta Segura first. Question again. Thank you for being here. You're one of three historic. You occupy one of three historic positions nationwide. City governments, local mayors appointing a heat officer, and between Miami, I believe was it Arizona, and then California, you're really leading that way. So if you can start off and tell us a little bit about the current initiatives that you're spearheading in Los Angeles to protect frontline urban communities, in particular Latino communities. And thank you again. You're on mute.
My apologies. I wanted to add to that, Professor Michael Mendes, that I'm the only Latina in the nation with that title of Chief Heat Officer. And I think I'm the only Director of Climate Emergency Mobilization for a major city. So this Chief Heat Officer designation is an expansion of my role as Climate Emergency Mobilization Director. And it has been a passion of mine all my life, as you well know. My father was a farm worker, then later a cannery worker. My mother was an agricultural worker as well, all of her life, 45 years in Del Monte Cannery. And she suffered from heat exhaustion, as did the assembly line workers. They would faint from heat exhaustion in the assembly line. And my father would tell me stories about what happened to him. So obviously I was super interested in worker health and safety, the safety of my community, and it just came naturally to me to focus on this issue, and particularly Latinos. So I'm really grateful to the Latino Public Policy Institute and you for inviting me to be here today. So as you know, our density alone in LA County is for Latinos, we're 49.5% of the population, makes us much more vulnerable. But then you add to that we live in the most pollution burdened communities as per CalEnviro screen. We have most of the outdoor jobs that really makes our community super vulnerable. And as you mentioned, many of those go unnoticed. That's why extreme heat is known as the silent killer, because it has gone unreported for so many years. And because the urban heat island or excessive heat stagnates air pollution, and these communities, our communities, the Latino communities, already have pre-existing conditions like diabetes, heart disease, asthma, COPD, and post-pandemic, people are more ill. So when you have extreme heat waves like this one, it sends more people to the hospital and it sends more people to a premature death. So it is a priority for the city of Los Angeles to address it in multiple ways. One is through communications. We launched a heat relief campaign that's creating external partnerships with non-governmental organizations, nonprofit organizations, and businesses to relay and convey the information on how to protect yourself. We want to also continue to improve our infrastructure. As you probably know, we're investing in more bus shelters, more hydration stations at those bus shelters, more shade structures at our open spaces and parks, and also ensuring that people understand that we have more cooling centers during extreme heat waves. This year, we had 16 open cooling centers from 10 p.m. to 9 p.m. And that's unheard of for a major city. And then you add that to our over 250 cool spots and our 73 libraries that are now serving as cooling centers. We had an extreme increase in the number of resources for this heat season. And I'm sure some of you read the LA Times. The LA Times didn't come to me when they were writing about the bus shelters and about our cooling centers. But the point is the city of LA is going to continue to invest in these infrastructure resources, but also we're working on a building decarbonization policy. And today, this commission meeting that I'm the executive director for, we're going to be presenting a community-driven building decarbonization equitable policy so that the city council can take their recommendations into consideration as we decarbonize Los Angeles. And that, as you know, will reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but the real goal is to create more climate adapted, low income units so that everybody has protection now and in the future from extreme heat in their homes. And they shouldn't need to go to a cooling center to get that kind of thermal comfort and protection of their lives, especially because we suffer the greatest amount of pre-existing health conditions. So we've got a lot on our plate, and it's a new position, but there are other women and women of color that are collaborating with me. I'm not doing this on my own. It's a very collaborative, coordinated strategy with the Emergency Management Department, the Planning Department, the Board of Public Works. I've engaged everyone so that we can do this in alignment and ensure that we have a coordinated network of plans. And of course, we want to coordinate with the county and with the state of California. So this kind of work requires a lot of alignment and coordination. But I'm doing what I love. And thank you for having me here today. I don't know how much time I have, but I don't want to take everybody else's. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Marta. And I know you were tested to your limits this summer in our historic hottest ever summer. It impacts multiple marginalized communities. So thank you for that work. And I look forward to talking to you about your decarbonization report. I sit on the National Academy's Decarbonization Committee. We have our own report, and I'd like to follow up with you on that. So thank you.
Of course.
Next up, I'm going to ask Luis Olmedo. And Luis, again, thank you for joining us today. If you could talk a little bit about what role can community members and community-based organizations play in addressing the consequences of extreme heat, which is one of the key climate impacts affecting your region as well.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Dr. Mendes. And I really appreciated hearing Marta Segura's new role, and I congratulate you in that. And clearly, having these positions filled is a proactive way to address a lot of these climate issues. And I can't help but think to also kind of elevate here the fact that when it comes to environmental protection, one thing I can think about Imperial County, and I know I'm going to put them on the spot here, but we have not had a environmental prosecutor for the last, I would say, 15 plus years. And so again, it just reminds me of how important it is to have these key positions filled by people who certainly come from that lived experience and understand the community and understand the demographics as well. But nonprofits or community-based organizations, whether they are formal nonprofits or organized groups, have been addressing a lot of these gaps that have existed in our communities. Take, for example, as you elevated, Dr. Mendes, is that COVID. It wasn't government that stepped up and addressed the issues immediately. What happens is that they have a very old, very heavy system that takes a very long time to cut through red tape to get the type of immediate interventions that are necessary to address a crisis. We need a modernization of the system as it exists today. It's not about whether the next heat wave or the next emergency is going to happen. It will happen, and it's going to continue to happen because disadvantaged communities have been underinvested. And I find the good thing that right now we have administrations at the federal level and the state level that are trying to right the wrongs of the past. And it is going to be critically important to fix policy. So I really can commend the fact of the panel that you brought together, because you have regulators, you have legislators, you have enforcers, you have everything here, including the community. Some of the things that are really important is to ensure to bringing in community-based organization to the emergency response system. It no longer works that it's a vetted space, only vetted officers, and people looking at each other, and they have no input in the community. That's one of the reasons why we created the Irvine network, which is a crowdsourcing database, to be able to give a community the opportunity to participate in being able to raise their concerns that are happening in their neighborhoods and being able to inform that into government. Going back to the COVID, a lot of these communities are already addressing a lot of these issues, compounded environmental health problems that are in the community. So again, with COVID, what happened, it was the nonprofit organizations that were out there already trying to get information. They had no access to testing at the time. So they did what they certainly could without the resources, but the resources were going from federal to state to county health. And then, they did what they could. But again, it took a long time. It took months before our federal government, the state recognized, we need to get promotoras involved. We need to get community organizations involved. And, the next crisis, which we're living right now when it comes to heat related or whether it comes to, the ongoing pandemic, we need to include nonprofit organizations. So anyways, I'll pause there.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you for those comments, and look forward to hearing more. But that really focus on the power of community-based organizations, and unfortunately, they become the stopgap measure organization to be on the front lines of disaster, because governments have not typically incorporated the needs of marginalizing communities of color, and just showing how your organization like yours is pushing back and stepping forward and ensuring that we try to get more resources directed to Latino communities as well as communities of color. Thank you. Next, I'd like to speak to Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia, who many of you may know is one of our leading climate change and equity leaders, not just in California, but also around the world, authoring some of the most significant measures in recent years around climate change, equity, justice, and health. So one of your key issues in our topic today is extreme heat. And you, along with Assemblymember Luz Rivas, Insurance Commissioner Ricardo Lara, authored AB 2338, which looks at a statewide extreme heat ranking system. Could you talk a little bit more about why you authored that, and what will it do to help protect Latino and other communities that are vulnerable during heat waves?
Absolutely, Doctor. Before I do that, let me just say thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the Policy Institute at UCLA for also putting this panel together. And I appreciate the introduction. And although, as they say in the barrios, they would say that's a lot of crema on the tacos. I'm just humble guy from the Coachella Valley who is televising live from Imperial County today, where it's really hot. And born and raised in this area, I can tell you that we are no strangers to this heat issue. But we grow up in it thinking it's just a normal hot day, right, in Southern California. But the fact of the matter is that we need to put into perspective today more than ever these long heat waves that we're experiencing and the impacts that it's having on our neighbors, our friends, our family relatives who are working outdoors, whether it be in the agricultural fields or those who are working in the industries such as the hospitality industry, who are out there manicuring the beautiful, desert that makes up the Coachella and Imperial Valley. I can tell you that this piece of legislation that was put forward by our insurance commissioner and chair of the natural resources and myself was something that we walked away from COP27 this past year, saying if other countries are doing this, smaller countries working in collaboration with the various governmental structures and their public health departments and emergency services agencies. California should be doing this. And the purpose of the legislation is to make sure that we have greater identification of where these hotspots in California are. Of course, the idea is to have a forewarning, right? Like we do with other emergency catastrophes that we can now identify, whether it be a hurricane, a storm, or for that matter, even an earthquake, where we can actually tell people, hey, this is coming and we got to get prepared. But from the perspective of heat, what we're wanting to do is identify these regions that are impacted disproportionately by this extreme heat. And we want to ultimately prepare these local communities in collaboration with all of the entities that have a role and a responsibility in this area and prevent, the loss of lives. That's really what the end goal of this policy looks like. And the next phase of this is to be able to utilize some of the dollars that have been set aside in the last few budgets, which is over $1 billion of investments, thanks to the leadership of folks like Luz Rivas, who chairs the Natural Resources Agency and represents San Fernando Valley. Those resources could be deployed to these regions to make sure that we're protecting people. So in essence, that's what the policy does. It's first of its kind in the nation, and it really continues to put California and the legislature at the cutting edge of doing things that no other state in the nation is doing. But for us, I mean, that shouldn't be the takeaway here. The takeaway is that we need to now implement this program and do it in a way where we actually can prevent illnesses and save lives throughout the state of California. So that's in essence what the bill does.
Great, thank you. We'll be asking you more questions about the innovative work you're doing, and thank you for that again. And like you said, it's really about implementation. The hardest part, of course, is implementation. So thank you for that. And now we're going to go to Marta Guzman and learn a little bit more about what the US EPA is doing to address extreme heat from the environmental justice perspective, and particularly safeguarding Latino communities. And you have a wealth of knowledge. You come into this position from many years working at the local level and at the highest levels of state government as well. So really looking forward to how that work is informing the work you're doing now for the US EPA. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mendes, and thank you to all my colleagues for pretty much saying everything I was going to say, but I will talk about a few additional measures that the Biden administration is taking forward. And I will obviously focus on the EPA, but I do want to recognize that it's a direction that we've gotten across government, most notably, of course, Department of Labor and OSHA working on heat standards that will impact many of the workforce, including some of the ones you highlighted, Dr. Mendes, that we don't often think about, the folks that come in and out of the extreme heat. And that's kind of the next frontier on the workforce side. But on the environment side, my tocaya said it well, that, we have to remember the obvious nexus, and you pointed out from the UN as well. There's a lot we're doing that I'll mention around adaptation, but there is even more we're doing to deal with the causation of extreme heat, which is the warming of our climate. But just real quickly, we have an interagency task force that does have a website called heat.gov, and there you can learn there about all of these agencies that are working together. But out of that effort, we were able to fund some grants to many of the communities, both here in California and throughout the region, but nationally. And we targeted these, we called it the Let's Talk About Heat Challenge, because as you just mentioned, we need to really communicate and have the tools to be able to communicate, especially with our subpopulations. And as an example, we did fund the Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project, which I know you're very familiar with, and Líderes Campesinas to do that work in Ventura County. But that's just, one example. I want to get back to the environmental nexus with ozone that you mentioned. And the amount of days that we have now with temperatures that can trigger the formation of ozone has expanded greatly. And you all mentioned this just the past week and a half here, where we had places like San Jose, Sacramento, Lancaster set not only extreme heat peak days, but continuous days of heat. And that's the real exasperation of our existing problem, which is we already have this problem of ozone formation in part caused by heat. And now we're going to have more of those days. And so the need for us to really get down those pollutants, those NOx pollutants, those criteria pollutants that have always caused us harm is ever more important. And so I want to, you all know these statistics, but we know that the propensity of those days is higher in Latino communities. It's the disparities. I think one of the studies that Davis released recently was that Latino neighborhoods are 6.7 degrees hotter than non-Latino neighborhoods. Other studies have found the similar. I was just down in Nevada where the Desert Research Institute found the same thing, that our communities are more greatly impacted. So we have enough evidence that the need to invest both our emission reduction strategies and our adaptation strategies needs to be in particular in those lower income Latino neighborhoods. And so I think there's agreement from the top, and the Biden administration obviously has the Justice 40 commitment to make sure that all of those investments, including that latest round of Inflation Reduction Act investments, goes to those most at need. I want to just highlight that I think, this is something that people know, but when you have these higher temperatures, the warming really causes the impact on the ozone. Let's just remind ourselves, it's causing the asthma rates, other respiratory illnesses, but also more of the heart and lung diseases that we're dealing with. Marta mentioned the premature deaths. So this is all really overlapping. So what is the EPA doing on this? It's what we've been doing. And much of this is seen as kind of like a climate reduction effort, but really, and thankfully, the Supreme Court can't take this away. This is coming from our bread and butter criteria pollution reduction. So we have explicit authority to reduce NOx, and that's really what we need to focus on. So what we're doing now is the president ordered us by the end of the year to really reduce emissions from the heavy duty truck sector. So in March, we proposed these rules and we'll be finalizing them by the end of the year, beginning with model year 2027. And also in the light duty and medium duty commercial sector, we're also going to be proposing regulations beginning with model year 2027. And I want to just acknowledge the leadership of California here. Obviously, the administration has put out the regulations of zero emission by 2035. That's something that is heavily influencing the national discussion, and I hope we can get, if not close, if not meet it, get close enough to that. But those are two of the major strategies, and really from a federal level, we have the responsibility to deal with all of these major mobile sources, especially in the transportation sector, like the railroad sector, which is a major contributor that we really know is hitting these communities hard. The aviation sector, and of course the ships, and all of that transportation corridor that needs to be electrified as soon as possible, and clean electrification. And finally, I'll just mention that the Inflation Reduction Act, in addition to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, but really the beautiful thing about the Inflation Reduction Act is it has a hyper focus on environmental justice. It appropriated $3 billion to the EPA for the first time for environmental justice, giving us this immense flexibility to really focus and be community driven. So when Luis is talking to us, when Marta is talking to us about what is needed in these communities, it can be really personalized. So, and that has to go coupled in hand with, of course, the regulation to transition all of our sectors, beginning with our transportation and our electricity sectors, to be all clean electricity. So thank you. And there's tons more in that Inflation Reduction Act that we can talk about that goes like to what Marta was talking about, and getting households to all electric, getting off of that warming gas and really getting us to reducing our impact.
Great. Thank you for spearheading some of that work, and really thankful to the Biden administration for the Inflation Reduction Act, and looking forward that you can represent Region 9 really well and ensure that those environmental justice dollars, good portion come this way. Thank you for that. And now I'm going to open it up to general audience questions. I'd like to start with an intriguing question that Beatriz Ricardi had. Do you think our Latino communities are underinvested because we are not proactive? So a little bit intriguing question there. Do you think our Latino communities are underinvested because we are not proactive? Anyone want to tackle that?
I think that the lack of civic engagement is as a result of the historical disinvestment in these communities, and having political leaders historically who choose not to engage those community members. So I think the problem runs deeper than some of us being proactive. It has to do with this historical pattern of intentional disengagement of low income communities, because historically politicians have gone towards the communities that vote in greater numbers and that donate in greater numbers. So I think that's, I'll leave it there because I'm sure other people have opinions.
And I think Luis went off mute. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, I mean, it's the reality is it's by design. I mean, it's no secret, right? We have different mentalities, different ideologies in this country, and disadvantaged communities, rural communities, agricultural communities have cared about the profitability of the industry, about business, and they have disinvested and created an educational system that creates a sustainable workforce. If we have problems in this country, it's because the industry has been addicted to welfare in our country and has created this level of poverty. That is the reality of it. You know, and you know, I'll be honest, you know, I get triggered whenever I hear it's like, hey, people are ignorant because they want to be. If I'm rich and wealthy, it's because, you know, I work hard for it. And that's not true. There's still privilege, and there's still a designed mechanism to maintain the people in poverty, and with the lack of access, the lack of resources, and the lack of opportunities, and the lack of pathways to get into, you know, professional careers, into colleges, universities, into trade jobs. I mean, I can go on, you know. So, you know, if people are disengaged, I also, you know, more recently in my older part of my career in this work, you know, I realized, and I look around my community, and you know what? We have no murals, we have no art, we have nothing that represents and tells us this is our neighborhood, this is our community. We're going to step up and we're going to protect it, because by design, they want people, especially Latino, disadvantaged, you know, poor communities, who are supplying the workforce, an aging workforce, a workforce that is more vulnerable and is at higher risk out there in the heat, right? It is by design that all this has been created so that we don't feel empowered and that we don't take ownership of their community, because the industry has benefited from policies in the books for the last 100 years, at least in Imperial County. And I know many communities like this have benefited from those policies and controlling politics so that it pats its pockets, so that it is sustainable for itself, but it created this level of poverty. So yeah, it's by design, and sorry to go off on that.
And Luis, I want to add one more thing, that I definitely want to thank the Justice 40 and the Biden administration for making that initiative. But it's after decades and decades of our movements, from the environmental justice community and the farm worker community to the Latino community, decades all pushing for this kind of legislation, and we finally are seeing it come to fruition. So it's not because of lack of engagement, it was a lack of representation and people who were able to translate what we were conveying as advocates and mobilizers to then integrate it. When we have more people like Marta and Marta Guzman up in the EPA, that is a reflection of decades of movement building.
Great, thank you. And Assemblymember, I'll ask you that question. We have about 13 minutes left, so I want to make sure we ask a couple of questions.
I'll be brief.
Sure.
I'll be brief. I think it's no coincidence that the makeup of the climate change leadership and champions today in the California legislature look like the folks that are on this panel. And I think you're going to begin to see, and I'm hopeful, right, that we will be more prescriptive and intentional with our policies and our investments, because we've got the data that tells us where we need to be going, and hopefully see the outcomes that we want to see as it relates to better public health circumstances for our families in California. So I'll just stop at that and look forward to the other questions.
Yeah, and again, moving away, that power building that Luis, Marta, and you all, and what the policymakers and elected officials on this panel are doing is, again, moving away from that abstract notion of climate change and disaster, putting a people-centered approach and ensuring that community stories, collective stories, real lived experience is implemented in our disaster and climate change programs. So I'll ask Assemblymember Garcia a question, and then I'll ask Marta Guzman another question. So this comes from Maricela Morales from the Executive Director of Cause in Ventura County. And she asked the Assembly member, how can county leaders partner with state leaders to protect the most vulnerable here on the ground in our counties?
I think it's a direct, conversation, not just with their representatives who are elected in that region, but it's really getting to know the agencies that are overseeing these directives that we're giving them, to make sure that collectively we're also holding a little bit of some accountability, right, on the front of the agencies. The idea of this emergency response bill is to make sure that those dollars are making their way to the counties. Those are the most appropriate agencies that oversee emergency service response. They're the agencies that oversee public health departments. And so those partnerships are going to be critical, but it's really getting to know who those agency partners are via, the introductions of your elected representatives at the state level. But it's really that direct communication and collaboration that's going to make the difference.
Great, thank you for that. And then Secretary Guzman, there's a lot of love for both you and Marta Segura for being Latinas leading on climate change, and a lot of comments in the Q&A, thanking you for that. And with that in mind, based on your immense experience at the local, state, and federal level, what are some of the best practices that you have seen that Latino communities, community-based organizations, and leaders can implement to address extreme heat and other climate-induced disasters?
Well, I'm going to bring it back to the Voting Rights Act, because as everybody has talked about right now, as Assemblymember Garcia just mentioned, not only are the county supervisors the body that's deciding on FEMA relief and other disaster planning, they're also the air districts. A bunch of counties like Imperial or Ventura, those are county-based air districts. You have the South Coast, of course, where most supervisors and council members make it up. So the local electeds are so critical to making this implementation. And the best practices are, there are some commonalities, but they're also going to be individualized to the community. So, everything from land use decisions, from, continued expansion of fossil fuels, be it in production or be it expansion of pipelines, all these things are real time happening right now in our communities. And those are locally led decisions, and the importance of having that local electeds. So in terms of, best practices that I would see kind of coming from the top to the bottom, it is really leading in the logistical transition to clean fuels. Be it clean charging infrastructure, be it clean energy generation, any sort of transition that is needed, it's happening through local permitting and local decision making. Whether they're gonna try to get some of the federal funding, most of the federal funding is going through local governments, state and local governments, and so having the leadership there to bring it down. Those are just some initial thoughts, but really having the local electeds there and having the focus on being the facilitators of transitioning all sectors of our economy to be dependent on clean electricity.
What wonderful, excellent examples. And I'm glad we have the federal perspective here. Luis and I were just at the UndocuFund and talking about our messaging and communication for a statewide network on migrant rights groups, bringing them into disaster and climate resiliency work. And I talked about Gavin Newsom's historic $150 billion of how that's funneled to local and state county levels. But I forgot to mention the Inflation Reduction Act and how that's scaled into local government as well, and the need for groups that are not traditionally thought as environmental to occupy this space, understanding these disaster impacts are intersectional and reach various segments of our society. So I'm going to ask Marta Guzman and Assemblymember Garcia one more question, and then we're going to end the webinar with Luis and Marta Segura. So we had one more question that I believe both the Secretary and Assemblymember can answer. This is from Nancy Zuniga. Farm workers are often talked about during extreme heat. However, there are other exposed workers like day laborers in LA and other parts of the state that aren't covered by Cal OSHA or at the federal level. Please share about how, if any, efforts are including workers at the margins. We need at the margin. Okay, that's the question.
Well, we've got a bill on the governor's desk that looks at outdoor work in general, and actually making sure that OSHA takes a revisit here on the standards that they are utilizing to declare, days that are extremely hot for workers that are outside. And, we've had some pushback, or at least along the way during the legislative process, we got some pushback on that in terms of how broad we wanted to go and who it would cover. But we're hopeful that the bill gets signed as part of the assembly package of legislative efforts to make sure that we elevate the extreme heat conversation from a perspective of workers, and also through the lens of public health, and of course our investments. And so there are legislative efforts underway to make sure that we're revisiting these OSHA standards to make sure that we're protecting folks that are working outside. There were some questions along the way if whether or not some of the folks that work, like the gentleman who you highlighted in your introduction for UPS, would qualify. And we definitely want to make sure that we revisit the policy moving forward next year, so that it does encompass a broader range of workers who are going in and out and are being impacted by this extreme heat.
Sure. And then Secretary, at the federal level?
By the way, you've really elevated my title here. I'm just the regional administrator,
Yeah.
But just from my previous work, actually from my days at California Rural Legal Assistance and the UFW, the California heat standard does apply to all outdoor workers. So it is obviously gets a lot of attention in the farm worker arena, but it is an outdoor worker standard. And I think what Assemblymember Garcia is talking about is that given the pace of warming in our climate, that standard needs to be continuously updated. And so that's something that we always have to improve as government, is to make sure our regulations are keeping par with the day-to-day. And I'll just reiterate that one of the recent studies from the Desert Research Institute is exactly what Eduardo was saying. That is, we know the risk to the outdoor workers, like the day laborers and so forth, but it's this new dynamic where people are coming in and out of the heat, and they don't have the acclimatization time. That is another sector of the workforce that needs more specialized attention. So I think I certainly hope and support that legislation is successful.
Great, thank you. We'll look for innovative approaches. And then we'd like to end our webinar. I think, Marta, if you can maybe say a few seconds before you have to jump off. One question is about the community level. So there's a lot of discussions about green infrastructure, shades, putting in trees, cool pavements, other types of material that diminishes extreme heat at the surface level. But folks were asking, what are barriers to implementing such type of green infrastructure projects at the local level?
Well, I mean, I guess I'd have to start with funding. For example, we do have a bus shelter hydration station 10-year plan, but we wish we had bus shelters and hydration stations at every bus stop right now. But we have been, I think, aggressive in trying to get those funded. So we were collaborating, obviously, with the MTA and LA County to make sure we get more resources and getting grant funding. But it's always about bundling sustainable funding sources together to be able to expedite your goals, your municipal goals. The other is really, you were mentioning community. I think advocacy from the community is key, and that's why our office, the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, has a very special blueprint of engaging frontline disadvantaged communities, both on our commission and in our focus groups and our Climate Equity LA series, so that they can be heard directly and we can prioritize based on community wisdom, not just on legislative wisdom.
Thank you so much for your comments. And the last word to Luis Olmedo about some of the barriers to implementation you've seen at the local level.
Yeah, well, much of it was covered, but I will highlight the importance that have been brought up about how these resources and Administrator Guzman, you said it very well, is all these dollars end up going through this old, outdated mechanism that I was talking about. And I'm glad you brought it up. We just need to change that. I'm glad Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia is here. He's certainly one person that can certainly spearhead that. And I know he has. So that's one. The other challenge is just making sure that we are looking not only at doing more research, and I respect the job of researchers. I respect the work and uplift the work of community engaged research, but we also need to do research to action, because there's a lot of information we know, and we've already been making the case historically over and over and over. And it's not until a pandemic that the whole world experiences that then it becomes a priority. It's not until a heat wave that affects not only disadvantaged community, but the wealthy communities, and then all of a sudden it becomes a priority. We have been dealing with a climate crisis. Disadvantaged low-income communities, environmental justice communities have the least ability and financial means, as Marta has Segura brought up. We don't have the resources. We need to have the resources to be able to adapt to this climate change, to be resilient. We can't just throw words and be creative about words. We need the resources. We need the money to be able to build these cool centers. In our community, we can't even convene anywhere in our community. We have to borrow space. We have to create spaces because we don't have community. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. Can you all see me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
I apologize. Another meeting was stepping in here. So we don't have community centers. And I know I've spoken to Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia. We don't have a conference center like large metropolitan areas have. And we're struggling with these situations. And again, we can spend so much time just talking about individual cases. In 2015, a young student died, because of heat exhaustion. We have an aging population within the farm workers. A lot of the population aren't going into agriculture. So but anyhow, I think that the other thing that came up was, and it does cause me great concern. We're thinking, blame the community. I know the question earlier wasn't about that, but it is just so important to continue to create a more welcoming atmosphere within our community, so that people feel like they can actually step into positions of power. And this audience, this panel, this is what equity and diversity looks like. I know that the leaders in this panel are very welcoming to everyone's participation, and we need to continue to drive that so that we can bring in better solutions into our communities. But thank you, Dr. Mendes, and your colleagues for putting this panel together.
Thank you. And just 30 seconds to wrap up. I'd like to thank our audience, our host, and of course our esteemed panelists that come here today. Regional Administrator Guzman, who hopefully will be secretary one day. Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia, a global climate leader. Of course, Marta Segura, another Latino at the front lines of climate change and action. And of course, Luis Olmedo, who's uplifting the best practices nationally and globally around community engaged approaches to climate change. And what we learned today is, again, moving away from those abstract impacts from heat, drought, wildfires, and having a human-centered approach to our policy making, our budget decisions. And as Luis pointed out, taking data, taking what they call science into action, and ensuring that what we do study, what we do measure, is for the public good, and that it creates social change. So I look forward to working with all of you and seeing all the great work you're doing on the cusp of climate change and equity in Latino communities. So thank you, and thank you again to UCLA LPPI for hosting us today. Thank you.